Potatoes are one of the most rewarding and one of the easiest plants that you can grow, especially if you are a beginner in the garden and you don't need a lot of land, you don't need a lot of soil, and you don't need an in-ground area in order to grow your very own potatoes. Matter of fact, we've been growing potatoes for about 3 years now, and we always use grow bags or food grade buckets in order to grow them, and we always get a pretty decent harvest. There are a lot of benefits to growing potatoes and other plants in containers, but we'll just say two that we found the most beneficial and the most telling of this method. So the first one is that it's extremely convenient. It's much easier to move your container to a different area in your garden than to dig your plant up and move it that way. And then the second reason is that it may conserve a lot of space in your garden. That does depend on how many containers that you are using and then the size of them. Now, whether you are choosing to grow your potatoes in the ground or in containers, you do want to be mindful of what growth medium you are going to use. Potatoes tend to prefer fairly fertile soils that have great aeration, good drainage, and good nutrient retention. So you don't want to use anything that is super heavy and dense like clay soils, unless you amend it with some components like pine bark or wood chips or sands, which can improve the drainage. And you also want to use some kinds of fertilizers like bone meal, which can improve the nutrient availability of it. A lot of people tend to use potting mixes, which already have those components like the pine barks or the other materials that improves the drainage. We like to use a mixture of compost and manure that we've been using for ever since we've been growing potatoes, so 3 years now. And all we do before we plant a new batch of potatoes is amend it with a little bit more compost and manure, and then some fertilizers, which like bone meal, which is our best friend, one of our best friends in the garden, to provide that phosphorus, which is essential for potato growth because it helps not only the overall health of the plants, but also helps in tuber formation. Another thing with using very heavy and dense soils like clay soils is that it could lead to very much smaller and misshapen tubers. So unless you want small, misshapen, different shaped tubers, then do not use those heavier soils. Now let's actually get into growing your potatoes. You want to put between 4 to 6 inches of your potting mix or your compost into your container. Now this does generally depend on what variety you are growing, because there's such thing as indeterminate and determinate potatoes. Indeterminate potatoes tend to have a sprawling growth pattern, and they develop their tubers in multiple layers throughout the container. Because of this, they need to be healed or mounded with additional potting mix or compost as the season continues, because this encourages putting more compost or more potting mix along the stem throughout the season, encourages the development of more tubers throughout the container. And these tend to be those late season potatoes. Determinate potatoes, on the other hand, have a predetermined growth habit. So they grow their potatoes in one layer. So you don't need to mound them or heal them in any capacity whatsoever. And they tend to be those early season potatoes, and they grow in a bushier growth pattern. Now there is such thing as mid-season potatoes, which could be determinate or indeterminate, and in order to find out which pattern they have, you kind of have to grow them and see whether they grow throughout the bag or one layer, and then you'll have your answer. Now, when you are ready to plant out your seed potatoes, you want to make sure that you have between 1 to 2 eyes or sprouts on them. Now, of course, we know that potatoes can grow a bunch of different sprouts all around itself, but you don't want to leave so many on them, because if you do plant a potato that has a bunch of sprouts on them, each of those sprouts develop into stems, which do go through photosynthesis to create that energy that is needed to develop those potatoes. But there'll be so many stems on that seed potato that energy that is going to be used into growing a bunch of different potatoes that will be on the smaller side, because that energy was divided between so many different stems on that one seed potato. So on the contrary, if you do leave 1 to 2 healthy sprouts on them, then that energy will be concentrated into developing tubers that are on the larger side, which, unless you want little potatoes, is what you want. Now, there are a couple different ways to put your potatoes in the bag. That does sound kind of funny, but just hear me out. So the most obvious way is to put those potatoes with the 1 to 2 sprouts on them in your container with the sprouts facing upward. But the other way or method, I should say, is that the people tend to use, especially if they have those larger potatoes with multiple eyes on them, you can cut your seed potato into chunks, each chunk having 1 to 2 sprouts on them, and you want the fleshy side that was cut, you want that to cure and dry out for a few days, and then you put them in the bag with the sprouts facing upwards. This will allow you to have more plants if you wanted some more plants from them, and then doesn't use a big seed potato taking up a bunch of space in your container. Regarding the amount of seed potatoes you plant in your containers, you may want to add between 2 to 4 for smaller or medium-sized containers, between 5 to 15 gallons, and upward of 6 potatoes in the larger bags, like 20 or more gallons. You may want to put more or less depending on how small your seed potatoes are, but just make sure you don't overcrowd them too much, because too many plants in one container may compete with each other for more nutrients. When you have put your seed potatoes in your bags and your containers, then you want to add a few more inches of soil over top of it and then water it in very well. And in a few months, you will have your very own potatoes. Now, we do like to go back and add some more fertilizers or at least some bone meal around our potato plants, just to make sure that they have enough nutrients that they need to develop some good, larger, healthy tubers. Let us know what your potato growing tips are below in the comments, and then what potato varieties are you growing, because we are interested to hear that out. So without further ado, to end this video off, as always, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And as always, plant to live, y'all. See ya.